My name is Elena Brookfield. I'm 27 years old, and I live in a small suburban town called Crestwood in the United States. What I'm about to share is not fiction, it's my real life, and it started with something so small yet it spiraled into betrayal, heartbreak, and a thirst for revenge I never knew I was capable of feeling. It's the kind of story you think only happens in movies, but I lived it, and I'm going to take you through every moment. I want you to stay with me until the very end, because there are secrets in this story you won't believe, and once you hear them, you'll understand why I couldn't stay silent anymore. So please, before we start, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who loves real-life stories that cut deep. This story is written and edited by Dark Life Side Diaries. It all began one warm summer evening when the air in Crestwood smelled faintly of blooming honeysuckle, and the distant hum of lawnmowers filled the neighborhood. I was standing in the kitchen of my childhood home, pouring myself a glass of iced tea, when my father walked in with an unreadable look on his face. My father, Richard Brookfield, was a man of quiet strength, retired police officer who rarely showed emotion unless something serious was going on. "We need to talk," he said in a tone that made my stomach drop. He sat at the kitchen table, his large calloused hands folded in front of him, and told me something I never expected to hear. Our family's entire savings had been stolen. Not misplaced, not lost, stolen. My mother, Marissa, was upstairs, unaware of the conversation, humming softly as she folded laundry. I sat down slowly, my mind racing. "By who?" I asked, my voice trembling. He hesitated, his eyes dropping to the table. "Your uncle, your mother's brother, Dean." For a moment, I thought I misheard him. Dean had always been a little reckless, a little selfish, but stealing from his own family? That didn't seem possible, but my father's voice was steady as he explained how Dean had convinced my parents to invest their retirement funds into what he claimed was a family business opportunity that would triple their money within a year. It sounded suspicious from the start, but he'd managed to manipulate my mother, playing on her love for him and his constant talk about keeping wealth in the family. The business never existed, the money was gone. My father had been too ashamed to tell me until now. I felt a surge of hot anger rise in my chest. I wasn't just angry for my parents, I was angry for the life they'd built, for the trust that had been shattered. The next few days blurred into one another. My mother cried quietly behind closed doors while my father called lawyers and financial advisors, trying to salvage what little they had left. Dean, on the other hand, had vanished. His phone was disconnected, his apartment was empty, and nobody seemed to know where he'd gone. But I couldn't let it go. This wasn't just about money. This was about betrayal at the deepest level, and deep down I knew something my parents didn't. Dean and I had crossed paths in a way they didn't know about, one that gave me an advantage. 2 years earlier, I caught him in a lie involving his ex-wife, a woman named Tessa, who had confided in me about his shady dealings. At the time, I'd chosen to stay out of it, thinking it wasn't my business, but now that information could be my weapon, I started digging. I went through old emails, old phone numbers, even his social media, which hadn't been updated in months. That's when I found a clue, a tagged photo on someone else's Instagram. It was of a beach in Florida, and in the background, half hidden in the frame, was Dean wearing sunglasses and laughing, a drink in his hand. The caption had nothing to do with him, but I recognized him instantly, and my hands shook as I took a screenshot. He wasn't gone. He wasn't hiding in fear. He was living it up with my parents' life savings. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind turning over every possible way to make him pay. My father had always believed in justice through the law, but I knew the legal system could take years, maybe even decades, to bring him down, if it even could. And Dean was the kind of man who could slip away at any moment. No, this was going to have to be personal. I would go to Florida. I would find him, and I would take back what he stole one way or another. I didn't tell my parents my plan. The less they knew, the better. All they needed to see was the end result. The next morning, I booked a one-way ticket to Miami. I told my mother I was visiting a friend, and she smiled faintly, probably grateful for any sign that I was living my own life amidst the chaos. But inside, I was already plotting every move. I knew Dean's patterns. He couldn't resist nightlife, women, or expensive drinks. I'd find him, I'd get close enough to learn where the money was, and then I'd make him regret ever thinking he could rip us off. I wasn't a cop like my father, but I had something Dean didn't: patience and the ability to make someone think they were in control when they weren't. When my flight touched down in Miami, the humid air wrapped around me like a warning. This was his world now: bright lights, fast money, and people who lived without consequences. But what Dean didn't know was that his perfect little bubble was about to burst. I checked into a modest hotel, the kind where nobody asked questions, and began to plan my hunt. I was no longer just Elena Brookfield, the small-town girl from Crestwood. I was the storm Dean never saw coming 2 days after the confrontation with Margaret. I could feel the atmosphere in the house growing heavier, like a thunderstorm brewing in the distance, and though Edward had promised me that things would get better, I knew deep inside that his mother wasn't done trying to make my life a living hell. Her glares were sharper, her whispers with Edward longer, and sometimes I caught her looking at me like I was an intruder who had snuck into her home to steal her sons' happiness, and every time that happened, I wondered how long I could keep pretending that her behavior didn't get under my skin. The nights became restless with me lying awake, staring at the dark ceiling, replaying every conversation, every sneer, every subtle jab she had thrown my way, until I realized that ignoring her would only let her dig deeper into our lives. So I decided to fight back in ways she wouldn't expect, calm, calculated, and precise. I started with small moves, rearranging parts of the kitchen in a way she hated but couldn't openly object to without sounding petty, replacing the old faded curtains she adored with fresh ones that brightened the room and seemed to irritate her every time she walked in, cooking Edward's favorite meals from scratch so he would rave about them at the dinner table in front of her, knowing she would boil inside at the thought of losing her place as the person who knew him best. But Margaret was no amateur. She began countering with passive-aggressive tactics, accidentally misplacing my things, gossiping to Edward's cousins about how I was trying to change him, and once even hinting that maybe I wasn't ready for the responsibility of being a real wife because I hadn't given her grandchildren yet, which was both hurtful and invasive. When Edward confronted her, she cried, twisting the story so it seemed like I had been the aggressor, and though he defended me, I could tell he was exhausted from being caught in the middle. That's when I decided it was time to gather proof. If I could expose her lies not just to Edward, but to the entire family, her manipulative power would crumble, and I could finally breathe. I began recording her whenever she started one of her talks with me, catching the venom laced in her seemingly polite words, the way her voice would drip with sarcasm when she complimented me, and how quickly it would harden into outright cruelty when no one else was around. I saved screenshots of her texts where she called me an empty shell or said that Edward deserved someone with real class. The more I gathered, the more I saw her pattern. She was obsessed with control, with being the unchallenged queen of this family, and I was the first real threat to that in years. Then came the perfect opportunity. Margaret was hosting her annual family dinner, the one event where every relative came to her house to fawn over her cooking and her supposed graciousness. And she had insisted that I be the one to help her in the kitchen, a clear setup to make me look incompetent or lazy in front of everyone. Instead of refusing, I agreed with a smile, knowing this was my moment to turn the tables. For 2 weeks, I prepared. I learned every recipe she planned to make and mastered them better than she ever had, then subtly swapped a few ingredients for fresher, tastier ones that would make the dishes unforgettable, but not so different that anyone would suspect me. On the night of the dinner, I worked quietly beside her, and during her snide remarks about how I was chopping vegetables wrong or burning the sauce, all while secretly making sure each dish was flawless when the guests arrived, they devoured the food, praising Margaret's incredible cooking until Edward, proud and unsuspecting, mentioned that I had done most of it. That's when Margaret's face tightened, and I could see her scrambling for a way to regain control, but before she could, her brother Woe had always been her harshest. Critics said it was the best meal she'd ever served, and maybe she should let me handle the kitchen from now on. The room erupted in agreement, and though she laughed it off, I could see the humiliation burning in her eyes. That small victory tasted sweeter than the dessert I'd baked, but it also fueled her rage. The next week, she launched a more aggressive campaign to paint me as manipulative, even suggesting to Edward that I was trying to isolate him from his family. What she didn't know was that I had anticipated this and had already prepared my next movie, a quiet, devastating piece of revenge that would not only prove my innocence, but show everyone the truth about her two-faced nature. And by the time I was done, she would have no one left to defend her. Weeks that followed felt like moving through a fog laced with barbed wire. Every step, her, and every breath carried a reminder of what had been stolen from me, but the fog also gave me cover to work in silence, unnoticed by those who thought they'd broken me for good. I spent hours studying every scrap of information I'd stolen from Jake's safe and Eleanor's hidden file drawer on my kitchen table, littered with photocopies of contracts, deeds, bank transfers, and photographs that painted a story darker and wider than I had imagined. It wasn't just about my father's company or my mother's death. This was about a web of corruption that reached across state lines involving shady land deals, environmental violations, and payoffs to silence anyone who got too close to the truth. Jake wasn't working alone either. There was a name that kept popping up in the records, a man named Thomas Greer, a corporate lawyer with a smile like a shark's and enough political connections to bury any scandal. The pieces began to click in my mind like a sinister puzzle, and with every connection I made, my hatred crystallized into something sharper, cold, calculated, and ready to be used. I knew I couldn't take them down by brute force. They were too powerful, too careful, and too insulated by their money and influence. Instead, I decided to become the kind of storm they couldn't see coming until it was too late. My first move was subtle, leaking small, seemingly unrelated documents to journalists who didn't realize yet that they were connected. A contract here, a suspicious bank transfer there. It was enough to spark quiet curiosity without alerting Jake or Eleanor that someone was pulling threads in the dark. Then I went after their allies, starting with one of Jake's partners, a man named Victor Lane, who was as greedy as he was careless. I sent an anonymous tip to the IRS about his undeclared offshore accounts, complete with proof pulled from Jake's files. Within a month, Victor was in legal trouble so deep he had no choice but to distance himself from Jake, weakening one of his strongest business alliances. But taking down allies wasn't enough. I needed something personal to shatter Jake's carefully constructed image. That opportunity came one rainy night when I followed Eleanor to a private club in the city, a place draped in velvet and secrecy, where the rich and powerful came to indulge in their most decadent and often illegal desires. I paid off a bartender to let me work a shift, hiding under a wig and heavy makeup from behind the bar. I watched Eleanor disappear into a back room with a man who was not her husband but a well-known state senator. My phone camera caught every illicit detail, every whispered exchange, every compromising touch. The footage was nuclear enough to destroy not just Eleanor's reputation, but also Jake's political connections. I didn't release it immediately. Timing was everything, and I wanted them to squirm under the weight of not knowing when or how they would be hit. Meanwhile, I needed to protect myself. I moved out of my apartment and into a rundown but anonymous rental on the edge of town, paying cash and keeping my movements unpredictable. I cut ties with most people I knew, speaking only to those I trusted completely. Hitch at this point was a very short list. The loneliness was brutal, but it was safer than letting my guard down. The only person I saw regularly was a former private investigator named Marla Kane, a wiry woman in her 50s with eyes that missed nothing. I'd hired her to help dig into Thomas Greer's background, and together we uncovered a history of shady dealings, from backroom deals with construction companies to suspicious consulting fees paid to judges. Marla was impressed by my determination, often reminding me that most people in my position would have walked away or settled quietly, but I wasn't most people. I had a plan that required patience, precision, and the ability to watch my enemies self-destruct while thinking they were untouchable. Things escalated when I discovered that Jake had been quietly moving assets into an overseas trust, possibly to shield himself from the financial fallout he sensed was coming. It was a sign that he was starting to feel pressure, and that meant I had to push harder. I anonymously sent the incriminating footage of Eleanor and the senator to a small but aggressive political blog, one known for breaking scandals others were too afraid to touch. The story exploded within days, the images and video going viral, dragging both Eleanor and the senator into a storm of public outrage. Jake tried to spin it, claiming the footage was fake, but the damage was already done. The senator resigned, Eleanor vanished from public view, and Jake's business associates started whispering about whether aligning with him was worth the risk. Still, Jake wasn't the type to go down quietly. I noticed unfamiliar cars parked near my rental, more often shadows moving in the periphery at odd hours. Marla confirmed my suspicion. Jake had hired someone to find out who was targeting him. This was dangerous territory. One wrong move and I could end up in the same shallow grave they'd likely put my mother in. But fear was no longer something I allowed myself to feel. It had been burned out of me long ago. Instead, I decided to use Jake's paranoia against him, feeding false leads through a disposable phone, making it look like his real enemy was someone inside his own circle. Trust began to rot from within his ranks, and soon he was lashing out at people who had once been his closest allies. The cracks in his empire were widening, but I knew better than to get comfortable. The endgame was coming, and it would require every ounce of courage, cunning, and ruthlessness I had left, because once I lit the final match, there would be no going back. Fire would either consume him entirely or burn me alive in the process. I didn't think I would ever have to face my father again after everything that had happened, but fate has a cruel way of dragging old wounds into the present. 2 weeks after the final blow to Uncle Victor's empire, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single line written in my father's handwriting. "We need to talk before it's too late." My hands trembled as I read it over and over. Too late for what? My first instinct was to burn it, pretend it didn't exist, and keep living the life I had clawed back from the ashes, but then I thought about the years of silence, the unanswered questions, and the gaping hole where a father's love should have been. I needed answers not for him, but for me. I arranged to meet him at an old diner just outside town, one I knew was quiet and out of the way. When I walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. He was thinner, grayer, his eyes dulled, but still holding that same calculating spark I remembered from childhood. He smiled a sad, broken smile and motioned for me to sit. What he told me shattered every remaining piece of the story I thought I knew. He confessed that he had never intended to abandon me, that he had been forced to leave because of debts to dangerous people. The same people who later became Uncle Victor's allies, he claimed. He had tried to protect me by staying away, though it was a twisted kind of protection. He also revealed that Victor had been the one to tip off those enemies about his whereabouts, leading to years of hiding. My father apologized genuinely, but I couldn't bring myself to forgive him. The damage had been too deep for too long. Still, part of me understood the impossible choices he'd faced. When I walked out of that diner, I felt lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because I had finally closed a chapter that had haunted me for decades. My life since then has been quiet, but not empty. I still live in the house I reclaimed, still run the small consulting business I built, and still keep a few trusted friends close. But I've learned something crucial. Revenge might bring a certain satisfaction, but closure is what truly sets you free. I share my story now, not because I want pity, but because I want others to know that you can survive betrayal, heartbreak, and loss and still come out stronger. The scars will always be there, but they remind you of your resilience, not your weakness. And to the ones who hurt me, uncle, my father, and everyone who underestimated me, hope they know I didn't just survive their games. I won. Thanks for listening to my story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life stories like mine.